Well, good morning. So, yeah, Aurora tries to make me old, but when I started, I was 12. When staff talked to me about doing this introduction, I said, but I've done this so many times. Well, you can talk about program, you can talk about this, you can talk about that. For me, it's always big picture, and that's what I'm going to talk about again. If you've been here before, you've heard some of what I'm going to say. You haven't heard certain pieces of what I'll say, but I've been doing this, particularly at Homes and Homeless, some 33 years. I've seen a lot, I've learned a lot, I've forgotten a lot. I remember a lot now. The pills help. and I'm going to share that with you. What I've learned in all this time, this is the last time I'll do this particular speech. I haven't done this speech in 7 years, this particular one. But today, Trump is president. It's more relevant than ever. And there's a lot to be learned. Whatever I share with you, some of you will agree. Some of you will argue with me. You have over the years. But I've seen it. When I came here, I came to Homes and Homeless for just 2 years. And look what it turned into. Because this issue isn't an easy issue. It's not a go-away issue. It's a staying issue, and you need to address it a certain way. So I'm doing what I always do. I'm going big picture. And to me, big picture is, what is homelessness really about? It's about poverty. And we who work in this field, I'm a political scientist. When you look at political science, you look at the system. And homelessness is a system today. There is a system, there are these demands, and these are supports that go into that system, and then there's public policy that comes out as outputs. But more important, there are feedback loops of what's good and what's bad about that policy, and it's all within the context of an environment. And nothing works unless you understand the environment. An environment for homelessness isn't simply about housing, it is really about poverty. And people argue with me, they say, well, we're not here to solve poverty, we're here to solve homelessness. Well, then you're looking at a real raw poverty, because if you're homeless, you're at the bottom of the poverty ladder today, and it's getting worse. So I'm going to put this into context. People tell me all the time, well, things are so bad, it's never been this bad before. Well, that's just not true. So let me set the stage. I'm going to lay out poverty, what's happened in this country. I'm going to show you how government plays a role. I'm going to show you how we're all responsible for homelessness. And if that's the case, then we have a responsibility to deal with it in certain particular different ways in order to, I'm not going to tell you eradicate it, because that's not going to happen, but in order to shrink it, which I think is possible into the future. Historians look at the past, and they analyze the past and explain what took place. Political scientists take that knowledge, and then they look at data in the present, and they attempt to predict the future. So I'm going to do a little bit of that here today. So this will be one of my free Columbia lectures, although I don't like doing it so early in the morning, but we will do it. And let's see where it goes. So let me begin. Over 200 years ago, Nancy Pelosi actually named, no one ever talks about Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine is one of the young revolutionaries who really is responsible for the American Revolution. Thomas Paine wrote in a small pamphlet called Common Sense, we have the opportunity to begin the world again. And the American Revolution began. These are revolutionary times today in so many ways. And people say, well, things are so different, they're so bad. We never had anything like this. So I just want to run through a few headlines and then explain it. So these are headlines from the newspaper. The two professional political parties both straddle the key questions of our time, but the new class party is silent about nothing. Sound familiar? The parties lie to us, the political speakers mislead us. The U.S. Senate has come to represent something more than a state or a region. They represent principalities and powers in business. Immigration continues unchecked. They form a standing army of labor. Everywhere, properties are in foreclosure. The government does little. Factories are shutting down entirely. 642 banks have closed their doors, and a fourth of our heavy industries are in decline or dying. Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. Now, those headlines sound like today, right? But they're all from the 1890s. Very important to understand that when you do analysis and you look to go forward, you need to look backward first. And if you look backwards, you'll find America is very much today what it was 120 years ago. Very much so. If you went back, and here's where we're going to begin with poverty, if you went back to 1900, poverty in this country was 50%. Now, why was it 50%? Because that was a tolerable number, because you could go west in those days. If you were poor, you came to America, go settle out west. That comes to an end around 1900. And 1900 really becomes the setting on what America is going to look like, what poverty is going to look like, and how if you work in this field or any field that deals with poverty, what your work is going to be targeted to and what it will look like and how you deal with it. So you go back to 1900. You know, the number one issue in 1900 was immigration also, but not from the southern borders, but from Eastern and Southern Europe. If you go back, there was also the 1%, the Gilded Age, the 1% and the 99%, the same situation today. If you go back, there was the Great Recession of 1893, equal almost to 1929 and certainly to what happened here in 208. And if you went back, you also had issues of race. You know, we had a civil war, we settled it. Constitution says everyone's equal, yet in the 1890s, we had separate but equal. You would be separate, you could stay in this train car, but separate but equal. Today we have Black Lives Matter, whether or not we have equality with legal issues. So the more things change, the more they actually stay the same. And we even had terrorism. In those days, we had terrorists who came from Europe, anarchists trying to destroy this government, all kinds of riots and things. You have the same thing today. Nothing is different. And you had homelessness. In those days, if you were homeless, you could go west. If you were young children with a big issue in homelessness, we sent most of them to the west on the famous train cars to work in farms, or they were called street urchins, and they lived in the city in alleys and doorways and everything else. So we begin in 1900. Now, the important thing about poverty in America in 1900 is not that it's so high, but it's how it is dealt with. Government plays no role. Up to that point in America, churches took care of poor people. Churches played a role in providing in communities, and Aurora says it's a local issue. She's quite right. Poverty is a local issue as much as national, but local, you're dealing with it. And that was left to communities. You go through the first 20, 30 years of the 20th century, and you see enormous change in America. You start to see poverty decline. And why? Why? Because it's a great period of productivity and change. If you look at America in the 1920s, for the first time, you have electricity in homes, you have automobiles in homes, you have toasters, radios, cars, clothing changes, culture changes, music changes. America's on a roll. It's very much like the 1990s, the same situation we had with the transition in technology. An important point about the turn of the century is that the one thing that was in transition in America more important than almost anything is the country was moving away from this agrarian nation where you could live off the land, where agriculture was the key product being produced, to an industrial nation. You go through that period and you start to see poverty decline from 50% to 20% by 1929. In 1929, you get the Great Depression, and of course, poverty's back up to 50%. 24% of the population is unemployed. People are traveling all over the country homeless, looking for work, looking for places to settle, and everything else. What happens at that point, and this is very critical from a political analysis that dictates what's happening with public policy and homelessness today, is government, for the first time, Roosevelt says, I'm going to give you a new deal, and government is going to play a role. And government comes in. Now, when government plays a role, there's going to be some kind of change because government controls whatever it does. It's going to control, Roosevelt says, I'm going to eliminate poverty. I'm going to eliminate poverty for the elderly. And you get Social Security. And with Social Security, you get, one of the articles is Aid for Dependent Children, which is the first public assistance program guaranteeing money to young women with children, right? And that gets implemented, and you start to see for the first time with government participating, public policy driving poverty down. And poverty goes down and down until you come to 1960. 1960 in America, poverty is around 20% again. And 20% is still a high number, but we're on our way. And you come to 1960, and a young professor over in City University, Michael Harrington, writes this book called The Other America, small book still used in urban government courses today. And he says, look, with all the good that's happened here, and in 1960, with all the change we have and how wonderful life seems, there is strict poverty in America. It's in the ghettos and urban centers, and it is in the rural centers. And Kennedy gets very interested in this, but of course, Kennedy won't be here to deal with it. But Johnson becomes president, and Lyndon Johnson is the second time a president says, you know, I think I can do something about this. And Johnson talks about as a young man, Johnson was a school teacher, his first job. He taught in a one-room schoolhouse in Texas for young Hispanic students. And he talks about how back then when he did that, he never thought he could have an impact on their lives. But he says, now I'm president, and I'm going to let you in on a secret. I have the power to do something about it, and I'm going to use it. So for the second time, government comes into play. For the second time, government is going to put its hand into public policy and work to reduce poverty. And Johnson gives us the Great Society. And the Great Society has some pretty good things. It comes with Medicare and Medicaid, right? Health care for the elderly and the poor. Food stamps for the elderly, for the poor. Head Start for kids to get a jump start, poor kids on their education. Secondary Elementary School Act, which says now we're going to pour money into public education and make it an equal opportunity to move forward for the young. We're going to give you an opportunity to dream the American dream. And of course, civil rights, which really, when we think of civil rights, we always think about it in the context of race. But the civil rights that Johnson talked about and the civil rights legislation was for equal access to the American dream, something very different. It was that everyone would have an equal opportunity to get a good home, a good education for their kids, and a good job to pay for it. And that's what the American dream has always been about. Johnson puts that into play, and poverty in America starts to go down. So much so that by the time you reach 1980, poverty's at 10%. Now, it's very important to watch these historical and political cycles for policy depth. 1900, 1933, you're on your own. 1933-34, government intervenes. To 1965, poverty goes down. Now, you're seeing 35-year policy cycles. That's how it works. Public policy is incremental going up, and it's incremental usually going down. And we'll talk about both aspects of that. But here we are in 65, and government's again playing the role, and poverty is down to 10% by 1980, lowest in history. But something happened along the way, and here's where homelessness comes into play. What happened was Johnson's idea about equal access was great, and people loved it and supported it. He won by a landslide. But how we did it became a problem, in that Johnson guaranteed access. So how do we do it? They said, well, we'll have access. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to build low-income housing in middle-class communities. And somebody said, wait a minute, what's that about? They said, we're going to now make education equal. We're going to bus kids from middle-class communities to poor communities and poor communities to middle-class communities. What's that about? And to do all of that and give people a chance to play in it, we're going to have quotas and move people to the front of the line for jobs. What's that all about? So what happens here is that you set the stage for a transition in what role government's going to play. And this really sets the stage for the lives we've been living since 1980. Everything you see today and the chaos in Washington and everything else is born right here at this point around those issues. How do you redistribute the American dream? And the public overwhelmingly said, not that way. And Ronald Reagan decides he'll run for president, and he runs for president, and he gets it. He says, I'm going to get government off your back. So what does that mean? You're not going to build any low-income housing in middle-class communities. How are you going to stop that? Goodbye, HUD. Not going to fund any public housing, all right? Which Johnson's the first one to, I didn't mention it, create HUD. So HUD is going away after only 20 years. It is now just a maintenance agency that just provides funding to keep things going, very, very little housing coming out of there. The second thing is there won't be any busing, okay? You have to excuse me a minute. I have allergies in winter. Figured out, right? Johnson. Reagan says, we're not going to bus kids anymore. I'm going to give you a voucher. And you can take that voucher and go wherever you want. Now, this is really significant because here's the decline of public education as we know it. You give a voucher to middle-class people. They're heading to private schools with that money, all these different schools that we're creating, charter schools that challenge the public school institutions. And I'm not saying charter schools are bad. I'm just saying we have to watch how we tamper with public education. Public education has always been the engine that socializes everyone that comes to this country into this country. The more you weaken it, the more you weaken the infrastructure to support this country, which is why you see so much chaos in what people think of government today. We don't teach civics anymore. I have students occasionally who can't tell me who the president was beyond Reagan. This is remarkable. And I'm at a quality institution. I'm always overwhelmed by some of this. But anyhow, public education starts to decline with vouchers, and give vouchers to poor people. Where are they going? Nowhere, in circles. There's nowhere to spend it. So you see public education declining, and then you come to jobs. And Reagan says, listen, there are no more quotas. If you don't like what happened, you didn't get the job, sue us. So we now lock into a period where government's not playing a role, but government's playing the opposite role. Public policy is now on the decline where government's going to change what's going on. Now, what's important for us here with that setting in poverty, and poverty shoots up to 15%. What's important for us here is that that's where homelessness comes from. Reagan then says, I will lock all of this in because I'm going to freeze public assistance money during a great period of inflation. I'm going to freeze daycare money. I'm going to do away with the public works program CETA that took people off public assistance, put them to work where they paid taxes and they were getting out of poverty. And I'm eliminating whatever HUD does, and I'm spending all the money on rockets and missiles. And which is what happened. And so here we go. America starts to back off. And getting government off your back, which is never really, I don't think people really understand. We're the government. So when I tell you that we're responsible for homelessness, basically, not knowing it, we are, because we wanted the government off our back. We wanted the government out of these things. We didn't like the way it was done. And rightfully so. It was a bad methodology for a good dream. And how you were going to make that dream happen was done wrong. And we alienated it, and politicians came and took it and ran with it, and have been running with it ever since. You go from, and I will come back to homelessness in a second, but I want to point out another date. You go from the Reagan years, you go from Johnson in 65. If we followed a 35-year policy cycles, we would expect change in 1996 or so, right? Well, we get it. Clinton is president, and Clinton now, for the third time an American president, says, I'm going to put my hand in poverty here, and we do away with aid for dependent children, and we get TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. Government is again stepping back. What's happening? Government is deregulating poverty slowly. If you freeze all these programs, if you eliminate these programs, and you really start to turn them loose and don't guarantee the basic public assistance program, you are now deregulating poverty. Just like you deregulated the airlines, the trucking industries. There used to be 20 airlines. Today there's 3. There used to be 50 trucking businesses. Today there's basically 2 or 3 really big ones. Everyone's an independent. All these industries that we deregulate take us back to the great line, Adam Smith, the great hand that's going to make everything happen, the invisible hand. And government is out of the picture. It's playing a different role, and poverty is growing in America. And now we're back in the 1980s with all of this that starts, and homelessness starts to come up. Now, I'll use New York as the example because it's the best example I know. I've been through 6 presidential administrations and 5 mayoral administrations on this issue. I have seen it from the very beginning to the very present. In New York City, in the 1980s, early 80s, in New York City, there were always 700, 800, 900 homeless families. They were victims of a fire. They were victims of loss of a job, something. They lost their apartment. Usually a 35-year-old adult with adolescent children who had work experience and had completed high school and everything. And we didn't have shelters for families in New York. We had them for singles. We had 1 male shelter and 1 female shelter for adults. But for families, the Red Cross would have 700 or 800 rooms every year, even less because that's what the population would turn through. And we'd put families in there that had this crisis and rehouse them. At that point, I was in government. This is the Koch administration. And one day, those numbers changed. One day we went from 800 to 1,200 to 1,500 to 2,000 to 5,000. A 500% increase. In those days, I was the first deputy commissioner for operations for all the homeless programs that were growing. Seniors, protective services, a whole bunch of stuff. The homeless was a small part back then. But all of a sudden, I had this major crisis. And the mayor would say, make it go away. And we would say, yeah, it's going to go away. But it didn't. It went straight up. And the Koch administration then said, and I talk about New York because New York is the first place this really starts to explode. It is in LA also, you see it at this time in San Francisco, but New York is throwing programs at it left and right. All of a sudden, we have to deal with this, so what would we do? We would put families on gymnasium floors for the night, on cots, with shower curtains around them on these stands, and say, you got to be out of here by 6 because school starts, the custodians are coming in. Give them cookies, milk, out, see you tomorrow night. We would put families in hotels back then, just pouring them into hotels, which we still do today, and they became terrible, horrible, crime-ridden, drug-ridden welfare hotels, with all the famous stories that go with that. Then one day we said, look, homelessness isn't a temporary issue. Homelessness is going to become a pretty permanent issue here in New York, and we're going to have to deal with it in a real way. And then we turned to developing models. How would we do this? How could we do this in a clean, safe way? There are children involved. And back then, we really started to realize that we had a children's issue being born here. So many parents were coming with tons of kids, and you know what to do. So we started to build the first transitional housing that you're kind of familiar with it around the country. It was a little different in New York. And that's how the kind of shelter, transitional shelters, started over here. Koch left. And he left with a crisis that we were trying to come out of. Along comes David Dinkins, the first black mayor in New York, who would be mayor for only 4 years. But Dinkins had written a big report when he was borough president that said, a shelter is not a home, which I would use for a title of a book many years later. It says, Shelter's Not a Home, or Is It? Because Dinkins came with the best of intentions. Dinkins moved everyone out of the welfare hotels. In Koch administration, we began to build low-income housing because the city inherited all this housing that landlords abandoned. We rehabbed it and poured in billions. It came online with Dinkins. Dinkins moved everyone out of the welfare hotels. 50,000 units came online. And before he left in 4 years, he refilled every welfare hotel. The theme that a shelter is not a home really started to transition, that a shelter is an alternative for low-income housing. By the time Dinkins left, that was becoming a realization. Along comes Rudy Giuliani, another normal New Yorker on the loose, right? So Giuliani appears. I don't know what happened to America's best mayor. He went south. He hooked up with America's best president. That's the problem. Another guy that we know only too well around here. So Giuliani's approach is, look, you're doing this all wrong. I'm going to deal with this how I deal with everything. This is a law and order issue. And Giuliani tightens the front door to the shelter system in New York. Now, the shelters are jammed in New York. And I'm only doing the family side here. They're jammed. So Giuliani stops. You want to bring your kids here? You here? You say you need something? I need birth certificates for everybody. I need addresses where you lived before. I need you to show all this documentation. Not going to work. It didn't work. People were getting turned away. Families are coming back 3 or 4 times. They're not getting into the system, so much so that the system backed up so far. Giuliani is here for only 8 years, that by the time he leaves, his last 2 years, it explodes. They can't control the door anymore, and he doesn't care because he's heading somewhere else. Along comes another great American running for president, Michael Bloomberg. Money and a miracle. That's Michael Bloomberg. I have money. I'll tell you what I'm going to do about homelessness. Not what all these guys have done. I'm going to reduce it by 2/3. Now, if you're me, and you're here from the beginning, and now you're in the nonprofit world, and you've been on the government side, you know how bad it is. And government's role is just get people off the street. That's all it is. There's nothing else. Off the street. I can't have them on the street. If the police come and I got a mother with kids on the street, I have to remove the kids. They have to go to foster care. It's going to cost us a fortune. That's what it is. Government is crisis and money. Nothing more. Manage a crisis and limit the money. Limit the cost. You get to this point, and now you have the nonprofit sector. You see, in the Koch administration, it was decided that we can't run this. We're going to develop a nonprofit world to deal with homelessness. And that's where it really gets born. It's born in New York City in droves. We start creating all these nonprofits. Now you have Bloomberg coming along and saying, I'm going to reduce homelessness by 2/3 with shelters that are jammed. And the question becomes, and here's where we start to get into some different public policies, how are you going to do that? So Bloomberg's idea was, and this is where there's so much debate today. There was recently an article in The Nation, if you haven't read it, you should read it, about rapid rehousing and housing first concept, which is a very powerful tool on the single side, but a very mixed review from my part on the family side. And I use New York as the example. Bloomberg pours tons of money into rapidly rehousing homeless families and bringing the shelter census down. In New York City, if you're in a family and you're in a shelter, you're here for a year and a half or more at that point. All right? Many people are here for several years at that point. So what are we going to do? We're going to create, and this comes out of New York. This is aside from the Section 8 voucher I'll talk about in a little bit. New York's going to create vouchers. We're going to give homeless families $1,000, $1,500 vouchers to pay their rent every month. Are we going to find landlords to take that? You bet. And how are you going to get those apartments? Now, I'm a landlord, and I've got a tenant here who pays me $500, but the government's going to guarantee me $1,500. You have to move. We're creating homelessness, and this is what starts to happen. We start to begin a spiral here. So Bloomberg's good intentions create something on the side that starts to percolate. But they move families, and in 5 years of rapidly rehousing thousands and thousands of families in New York City, paying all these rents, several things happened. The census went down significantly at the front door. The length of stay dropped to 4 months. Families were being rehoused. Now, vouchers sound great. And the problem is, especially when we're on the advocacy side, anybody who wants to give me money to move a family, I'm there. But how long is it going to last? 2 years, 6 months, 12 months, a lot of variation on this. But 2 years is the norm around the country. All right, that's the extreme norm. A lot of places a lot shorter. But in Bloomberg in New York, we give people vouchers, send them away in 2 years. And we say in 2 years, you'll be independent, you'll be okay, you'll be able to do this on your own. Bloomberg was here for the first 8 years when he did this. And then he decided, you know what, I'm going to run for a third term. And he did, and he won. If you're smart, when you're in government and you're in politics, the smart thing to do, 8 and out, okay? Which is why, if you were here years ago, we had 10-year plans. I'm out. There's still 2 more years to go. I got you on your way. Lots of luck. And the same thing with the 2-year vouchers, I'll be gone. But Bloomberg bought into a 3rd year, so he's going to inherit what happens. So the census went down for a short time. When people started to see, you know, the homeless population in New York, there's 60,000 people in our shelters tonight because that's capacity, all right? That's capacity. And people say, well, you know, there are only 12,000 families in New York, only 21,000 kids, and around the country. Oh, homelessness is going down. Really? Because tonight, it's pretty soon, right? It's January. We do the national count. On the coldest day of the year, in the middle of the night, of course it's going to go down. You have to be nuts to be laying on a curb in the middle of the night, right? And every year, I'm always amazed. They come back, look what we have. It's down. What idiot wrote this one? For families, we push them out. We say, here's a housing first voucher. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. So you rush a family out, and they say, well, now you don't need that bed. And we reduce beds. Then we come around and we count beds. Oh, there are less beds this year. Family homelessness, down. In the meantime, while all these numbers are down, tell me why there are 1.3 million kids in the public school system that are homeless, right? In New York City today, there are 114,000 homeless kids in the school system. Only 12,000 are in the shelters. And those 12,000 you cut in half because some of them are in school age. Look at the population that's doubled and tripled up. Look at the potential future homeless families that are there. This issue isn't so easy. There's no easy answer here. We come back, and Bloomberg suddenly has a problem. Everybody wants a voucher, and they come into the shelter system, right? All these families that we're moving in New York City, they're running out of the 2-year voucher. They're coming back to the shelter. Now, New York City always had a recidivism rate, a return to shelter rate of about 18 to 20%. Suddenly, in the Bloomberg years, it starts up and it hits 50%. Half of these families are coming back, and the arrows are still going in that direction. The third problem that came with Bloomberg, the cost went through the roof. The city of New York, by the time it was done with a 5-year experiment with rapidly rehousing homeless families, had spent $1.2 billion on a program that failed. It was a total wreck, and in the end, by the time Bloomberg leaves, they have to open more and more shelters. And the city of New York went from having a moratorium on shelters to opening as many as they could. So along comes another leader from New York, de Blasio, running for president too, right? Maybe the person next to you is running too. You got to watch it around here. It's a disease in the city. So, yeah, excuse me for a second. But de Blasio comes along, criticizes Bloomberg, and says, look at the mess this guy made. Now, again, if you've been around like me, I've seen this mess 4 or 5 times already. Listen to this brilliant plan. I'm ready. And here comes de Blasio. And good intentions. All of these mayors had good intentions, but they didn't know their environment. They didn't know what the feedback loops were, what policies were failing, that these demands and supports weren't producing the right policies. So de Blasio puts 3 big initiatives in his program. He's going to take 300,000 housing units to preserve and develop low-income housing units in the city of New York, affordable units. You're in the business, you know what affordable means. Affordable for you, but probably not you, and not you. 40, 50,000 income, 60, 70, some are 80,000 income. The families we work with are hitting those numbers, and we know it. So, yes, we're maintaining low-income housing so we don't produce more homeless, but we're not solving homeless on the end. The second thing he does, and there will never be enough housing. The housing in the United States, the last time you had low-income housing equal to low-income residents was in 1970. That was the last time there was a balance. That was part of the Great Society. There is no more balance. HUD doesn't build anything. In fact, we knock down these big towers and we put up a couple small one-family homes. You displace everyone, you're creating more homelessness. So that first part of the plan is good intentions, but it's not going to solve the problem. The second is prevention. And you know, all these programs that come with new names. Prevention, they name it in New York, home base. I've been around. I've seen it named 12 different things over 30 years, right? Not new to me. Every time there's a new program, been there, seen that, done that. And so they put it, and they pour tons of money into preventing people from becoming homeless. Well, what you prevent today is reality tomorrow. You're not going to prevent it for everyone, and sooner or later, part of this population will come into the system. The third thing de Blasio does is he takes the voucher system, and he targets it much better. He breaks it up into a number of vouchers based on certain kinds of needs, whether you had a mental health problem or something else, and that's good. But again, All of these vouchers are time limited because of cost. But the voucher system is a revolving door. It always has been a revolving door back to shelter, because when it ends, you're back one way or another. But these are the core of the de Blasio program. And what happens with de Blasio, that by the time they're done, and we're still in the middle of this, he's coming to the end of another year and a half, his term will end, and we'll be on our 6th administration with a new genius to solve homelessness here in the city. By the time we get to that, the city of New York is opening 90 more additional family shelters. Can you believe it? 90. So what does that tell you from a public policy perspective? Things aren't getting better. The government recognizes the problem, and it's on the move. And what are we doing? We're simply warehousing poverty. So I bring you back to poverty, that homelessness is about poverty. The problem with homelessness, and the reason why it can't be reduced or solved these days, is because it's always been a one-size-fits-all lopsided public policy issue. And by that I mean the issue is not simply providing housing. You can put a roof over somebody's head today, doesn't mean you won't see them tomorrow. I have people tell me we've rapidly removed families here, and they've been out for 2 years. I said, yeah, where are they? Well, they're moving around. Are they where they were? They're not back in the system. They're back on a couch. They're back with a friend. They're back with a relative. And eventually, they're back in the system. And that's what I've seen over 33 years on that one. So when you address homelessness with this one-size-fits-all lopsided policy, you're not addressing it, because if you've worked with the population, you know, basically I've come to the conclusion that they break into 3 groups. There are 3 groups of homeless. There are first low-income, working poor families that got caught up in homelessness because their neighborhood gentrified, because they lost a job, because someone got sick and they get pushed into the system. Once you get pushed into the system, it's a problem, because just because you came in doesn't mean you're going out. There's a line. Go to the end of the line and wait your turn. These are families that can be rehoused immediately. This is your housing first, rapidly rehoused population. If you come in here, they have tenancy skills, they have work skills with real jobs that they've had. These are families you can move out, and you can take a good percentage of your population right out of the shelter system. They average 18 to 20%. Take it off the board. Then you come to your second group. Your second group are younger. Young parents in their 20s usually, some in their teens, male, female. We know that many, many single female-headed households with 1 or 2 children under their arms. About 50%, the real number is about 57% have finished high school, 43% haven't. No work experience here. People tell me all the time, it's such a joke, 90% of our population in our shelters have jobs. Do they have meaningful jobs? Do they have full-time jobs? Do they have jobs that pay minimum wage or above? The answer is no. So you're not going to solve that problem. Here you have a young population, young kids with kids, who need to complete their education, who need to be job-readied, job-trained, and eventually employed. And that can be done. The greatest opportunity is with the youngest of the population, and that's what you have in the middle group. The third group we all know very well, the chronic homeless. These are usually older population. They're victims of domestic violence, substance abuse, mental health. Mental health in the family population over the years was, for me, I would always look at that number because I had worked in government and mental health for a while. It was 2%. That was always interesting on the family side. Today, it's 12%. It's moving. This population is changing. We're seeing dramatic change here. And you have families in the chronic system with foster care histories and all of those problems. What happens with the chronic population? They're the most through the system over and over again. They need specialized services. They need to be in specialized facilities with really high-trained people to help deal with these problems. If we can reduce these problems, then we can move them, I have concluded, not to permanent housing, some yes, but not all, but supported housing. This is your real supported housing population over here. So if you look at homelessness, you have a 3-tier system. People who don't belong here and should be out of here. Young kids who, since they're here, we have an opportunity to finish their education, link them up to community colleges, get them to work, get them hooked with daycare, and get them off public assistance and out of homelessness. And then a group that really needs some intensive care for quite a while in many different ways. Now, if you look at homelessness like that, and you see it after all this time, and it hasn't changed. What has changed I'm seeing now lately is we have a lot more young people coming into the system, which tells me it's a new generation that I'm seeing for the third time, coming into the system, and a lot of young women who haven't even had a baby yet, they're pregnant. We're seeing a lot of that. Now, that's if you're running the operation I'm running, that's a real flag, because that drives your services. I'm not going to talk about services because I'm doing the big picture, but what you do in your facility is driven by who you get. And if you understand your population, that will drive the services you need to provide. And simply because you have children there, you have basic services you must have. You have to have after-school programs. You have to have art programs. You have to have recreation programs. You have to have teachers on site. You have to have daycare. Because this next generation, I have people who come back who were kids in our shelters. We've served over 80,000 families, 140,000 kids. I've seen it all. They come back as adults. Remember me? You know, I do. And that's a sad tale. And what do? They teach their kids. It's the same thing. This is how we live. We move, we move, we move, we move, we move. I once labeled that poverty nomads. We've created poverty nomads in America, people who are poor, who are used to a nomadic state of moving all about. The way it works is you usually come out of some system or you're aged out of your family and you're going to live with a boyfriend, you're going to live with your grandmother, you're going to live with some friend, and then you're going to live in a shelter. And then you're going to get out with a voucher, and you're going to start again in 2 years or less. This is what takes place. And not for everybody, but this is the big part of the system. It turns over and over and over and over. So what is the answer? In New York City, the answer? Well, let's build more shelters. So now New York City, and the country, in fact, because shelters seem to be the answer. The problem with shelters are short-term concept. Shelters are an emergency concept. But homelessness isn't short-term, it's permanent. It's long-term, it's chaotic, it needs certain disciplines in certain areas, and it needs to be managed in a public policy sense that makes sense, all right? So what do you have? You find yourself in this quagmire. Where do we go? Well, we know the answer. There's no surprise. The more shelters we open, we grow the homeless system more and more, and the more we grow it, the more we fill it up. The second thing, families will come, and they will recycle, and new families will come, and they'll get into that swing also. The third thing that's going to happen is all the cost we pour into homeless programs exceeds expectation. It just grows and grows and grows. The budget in the city of New York for homelessness today is $2.2 billion. The budget for the fire department in New York City is $2.2 billion. Go figure. You tell me this isn't a crisis. Think again. And the fourth thing that happens is you alienate the population. Why? Because you're opening these shelters wherever you can find space, wherever you can find a building. And communities are saying, what are you doing? We don't want this here, not in my backyard. We're here. And so public opinion hardens to the homeless. And then when you hear the word homeless, you think of the single on the street. You don't realize it's a kid. No politician is going to run on a platform. Here, look, let me show you homelessness. It's a child. Because it's a losing proposition for him or her. So you never see that. You never see the face of homelessness. Yet homelessness today is a young kid. It is a young kid who is in school failing. Homeless kids get left back at twice the rate, suspended at twice, 3 times the rate, repeat schools, drop out. It's over and over. And every time that happens, for every kid that drops out or repeats a class, it's $20,000. Multiply that times 1 million kids, and look what the hell you got. A fortune going nowhere. So our public policy has been chaotic at best. We're wedded to this housing concept, but this is a poverty issue, and we should be wedded to the poverty of it. If we don't solve some of these variables that are bringing people back here, we're never going to solve this issue. We need to rethink what we do with shelters. We need to think more. You know, transitional housing got such a bad rap around this country. Anybody who wrapped that program's out of their mind. It's one of the few things that really worked, right? And we took the investment out of there. One of the biggest problems, Aurora hit on it before, homelessness is not a national issue from a public policy point of view. HUD is not the answer to homelessness, yet HUD has the money. And if you want your money, you're going to do what we say. So HUD gets these groups that they fund, certain advocacy groups who will tell you, this is your line, read this paper. Housing first, rapid rehousing is excellent. We have lowered the numbers. Maybe. But what the hell do they know? They running any programs? The answer is no. It's local. It is a state and local issue. If you really want to have a national policy, this is what it is. HUD, create a block grant and give it over to the state and localities. They know their population, they know their people, and they know what they need to do. These are the key points. Our public policy, all these outputs in the system have been going in the wrong direction. And we tolerate it because they hold the purse string, because they say you won't get this, you won't get that. And this will never be solved in my time because they have us all divided. You need the money, right? So you go where the money is and you have to buy into it. And sometimes, and again, I tell you, rapid rehousing works for a certain segment of the population, but for others it doesn't. And you have to do what many of you maybe don't want to do, but you have to do it. But we allow them to get away with this. And now think about it. Everybody's looking to Washington for the answers. Come on, the guy who's running HUD is a doctor, a baby doctor, right? Go figure. And just take a look at the administration. They are deregulating everything. Don't drink the water. You're on your own in here. There's mercury in your water. The environment is deregulated. There's no heat wave. There's no global warming. It just happens to be 1,000 degrees everywhere you go. All of this stuff is just moving government out. Now, it's so important because if you run these 35-year policy cycles that I spoke about and that we speak about in political science, there shouldn't be any change if these cycles hold until about 2026, 27, 28. And if you look at the policies that are coming out now, and that's just a short time from here, they're going in the opposite direction. I told you public policy is incremental going up, and it's incremental and sometimes more rapidly going down. We're in a very, very serious policy decline in this policy area. And we're on our own more than you ever wanted to imagine in dealing with family homelessness. And you're going to have to think in different ways, and you're going to have to buck the system. I would say to Aurora, you know, we need a National Association of Poor People and of providers. What happens if we say to HUD one day, look, AARP for $5, look what you get, right? I'll give it to you for $1. Everybody's in. Give $1 and we have a national association. What happens if we say to the government, you know, we're not going to take your money now. Now there's homelessness everywhere. What are you going to do? You want to change public policy, you have to change how you think. Don't let government sell you this stuff. Remember the Interagency Council? The answer to everything? Today, there's no teeth. There's nothing to it. We are really out here adrift. So what is the answer? In all this time, I'm very optimistic. You know, I paint this terrible tale, but it is what it is. It is what it is, and if you don't accept what it is, you can't solve to make it better. There are answers. Homelessness isn't going away, so what have we done here? I mean, my dream was always, after all of this, I stuck around this long on this issue. This isn't my policy training. I have no training in this at all, except what I got here. The real policy answer to this is to think beyond the shelter. And I've spoken about this before. But today, that dream is a reality. It opens today, right, John? Today. We don't develop shelters anymore. And, you know, we call them community residential resource centers, but you open a community center. We always thought back in the early days when I did this in the Koch administration, and we built these first facilities, we thought the homeless crisis someday would go away, and we'd take these nice transitional housing sites and turn them into community centers. Today, we shouldn't have shelters. We should have community residences. And it's not a new idea. They did it in mental health when they deinstitutionalized everybody. The only thing, they stopped spending the money on it. You would take people from an institutional setting, which is what a shelter is. It's an institution. Take them from that and put them in a community residence and transition them back into the community. And we should build these facilities that have, the one we just built has 99 units. It has as at its core a culinary institute, because we think there's a lot of jobs that you can get in culinary training to work out in the field. It has educational components so that people can complete their educations there, get linked to community colleges there, and build them into communities where the homeless families are coming from. Don't take a family from here and put them over here where there's no linkage with the community they know, the pharmacy they know, the doctor they know, the families they know, the grocery stores they know. We displaced this whole system. This is not public policy, this is public chaos. We need to rethink. We shouldn't be building shelters anymore in America. We should be allocating that money to community residences where the community participates in the program. You want to be in the culinary program from the community? Come on in. You want your kid in daycare? Come on in. Here's a few slots. You want them in the after-school program? Come on in. And then you work to transition these families out and permanently into jobs to maintain a family. Because the issue is not housing, it's housing stability. I've been using that term for decades, and no one ever bought into it. One of the big rewards about being around so long, the disadvantage is you get old doing this, but the advantage is you get to see the things you spoke about come into fruition. I have been using that term for decades. It is your ability to maintain your home, not your ability to get a home. If I'm in government, I can give you one tonight if I really want to. But your ability to stay there. And that will replace the voucher system someday. If we rethink and understand homelessness as two things, two important things. First, it's an education issue, all the way from parents down to kids. Second is it is an employment issue. Without employment, whether there are subsidies that go with you or something else, unless you're able to maintain a job to supplement what you need to raise your family, you will not be able to maintain your stability, housing environment. And third, for those with special, really needs, the chronic homeless, all is not equal. Specialization goes here. We can't have all this under one roof. It will not work. But if we rethink this, if we rethink of community service centers like that and start to rethink of what this should look like, we can begin to not eliminate homelessness, but integrate, this word homeless is horrible, integrate poverty back into the community to raise up the entire community. The community participating in these facilities, you go to a poor community, you're going to be hostile if we build this here? No way, we need those services, let's go. Instead, we go to these middle-class communities and we open these things where everybody goes crazy overnight. So all I'm saying is what I've learned, there's a lot to rethink about here. There's a lot to imagine differently. There's a lot that I've seen it over and over and over again. For me, the answer was always to build and have a community residential resource center. And we just, if you went on the tour to Ali's place yesterday, some people went, right? You see the first making of one in New York City. I think it's the prototype for the city of New York to move into the future. We can't build 90 shelters, but can we build 90 community centers that have a residential component, temporary for people from that community, young mothers with kids with educational components in the community participate? I think so. So I'm throwing that idea out to you. Now, they're going to yell at me and tell me to get off. They put a clock in front of here for me, you know. They always complain. I always tell them I'm paying for it, so sit down. So let me finish how I always kind of finish this thing. To me, this has been a long journey, you know? I've been 42 years in public service, 43 years at the university, and 33 here in homelessness. That's a lot, right? I don't know how much longer I have to go. But, not because I'm leaving, but in New York, you get run over if you're not careful. Everybody gets run over every day in New York City. There's a hit and run. But for me, the analogy to all of this, to public policy, is that America is a warring nation. If you look at this country, from the very beginning, the Revolutionary War, we are at war every 15, 20 years. Revolutionary War ends 1787 or so. By 1803, we're in war with the Barbary pirates. 1812, we're fighting England. 1848, we're at war with Mexico. 1865, we're fighting ourselves. 1870s, we're fighting the Indians. 1898, we're fighting the Spanish. World War I, 1914, 15, 16, we're in Europe. World War II, we're in Europe. 1950s, we're in Korea. 1960s, we're in Southeast Asia. 1980s, we're in Iraq. 2000, we're in Afghanistan and Iraq, right? We are a warring nation. There are lessons in war. There are two things that happen when you go to war. You're either going to fight an all-out war to win whatever you started with, and you're going to allocate all the resources you have to doing that, winning the fight, or you're going to fight a war of attrition. And we fight wars of attrition much more these days. The problem with war of attrition is they're long. The Afghan war is a war of attrition. And what is a war of attrition? You don't allocate full resources for all kinds of reasons. And we're going to do this, you can't go here, you can't do this, no, you can't use that, X, Y, Z. And what happens? Wars of attrition have their toll. In Afghanistan, we have several thousand deaths tied to that, and we have some 30,000 people who mentally and physically have become handicapped in one way or another from that war. But the most interesting war for me has always been Vietnam, because Vietnam, although only 7 years, half the time of Afghanistan, was a war of attrition that was much greater loss than anything else. In Vietnam, we lost 55,000 men and women whose name appear on this wonderful monument in Washington. You know, it's the most visited monument in the nation's capital every single year. Every single year. And Vietnam was a war of attrition. We never know or will know what all of those people could have been. But what's so important about is Vietnam, whether right or wrong, when we went to war in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson declared a war on poverty. The war on poverty is America's longest war. It's gone on 60-plus years. And the war on poverty has never had a full commitment to winning. It is a war of attrition, not in the tens of thousands, but in the millions of men, women, and children never be all that they could have been. And the names don't appear on a big marble monument in Washington. They appear on the prison rolls. They appear on the welfare rolls, shelter rolls. They appear on names in ghettos all across the country, and no one comes to visit those monuments. Now, Robert Mcnamara, who ran the Ford Motor Company in 1960, was picked by Kennedy. He was a whiz kid, could come and be Secretary of Defense. Robert Mcnamara was brilliant, but he became the architect of the Vietnam War. By 1968, he couldn't take it anymore, and he resigned, and he went to head the World Bank. Mcnamara never spoke one word in 35 years about Vietnam, wouldn't answer any question. He retires around 2000 from the World Bank, and for the first time, writes his memoirs. And he writes, and he made a movie about it, Out of the Fog, if you've seen it, and the fog of war. And Mcnamara says, you know, if only we had thought through what we were doing back then, if only we had looked with hindsight what we had done, where we were going, what worked, what didn't work, perhaps there would be less names on that wall in Washington today. Well, I tell you that if we don't think, if we don't step back and look at what's happened here after so many years with homelessness and how we've approached it, we're still pretty much doing the same thing. We're adding things to it, but we're still with the same concept that it's just housing, 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 and we're missing the point. The advantage of having so many poor people within facilities that we run is a unique, as unfortunate as it is, it's a unique opportunity to make a difference in all those lives with educational programs, employment programs, to deal with domestic violence and all the other issues that are there. It's an opportunity that we're missing. We're dealing with it little by little, but that should be our national public policies. The money that's coming out of Washington should be totally towards education, not a little bit of McKinney money here, a little bit here. Big money, big dollars. This is the thing. So Mcnamara made that point, and I tell you that if we don't stop and think what we've done here for the last 30 to 40 years with homelessness, we will add many more names to those less illustrious monuments of poverty that I spoke about before. So I'll end as I began. 240 years ago, Thomas Paine wrote, "We have the opportunity to begin a world again. All we have to do is remember that he wrote in a simple pamphlet called Common Sense, and I've just shared 33 years of it with you. I'm tired." Okay? Thank you. I hope you like the conference.